The roar of 100 motorcycles shattered the quiet evening as leather-clad riders surrounded a small-town mechanic's shop. Inside, a single dad stood frozen, a wrench in his hand, wondering why fixing an elderly woman's car had summoned an army of Hell's Angels. Before we dive in, leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind even more than this one. The last rays of a late summer sun pooled across the concrete floor of Caleb Mason's small-town garage, turning scattered bolts and wrenches into tiny copper coins of light. The workday should have been done. The air smelled of motor oil and old wood, a scent that clung to his shirt the way memories of his wife still clung to his heart. He'd locked up half an hour ago, swept the floor, and was wiping his hands on a rag while thinking about the night ahead. Pasta bubbling on the stove, a scratched DVD of old monster movies that Max loved even more than he once did. 10-year-old Max was upstairs in their apartment above the shop, probably already deciding which movie would win tonight's vote. Caleb pictured his boy's eager grin and felt a small lift in his chest. Simple plans like that were the backbone of their life, fragile but steady. The quiet stretched like a blanket over Willow Creek. Outside, the town's single stoplight blinked lazily, and the faint whistle of the distant freight train marked the evening's rhythm. Caleb liked this hour, when the noise of customers and ringing phones faded, and only the soft tick of cooling engines filled the space. He was reaching for the light switch when a sound broke through, a rough, uneven rattle that didn't belong. It wasn't the easy hum of a passing car. This was a cough and a gasp, a machine limping toward its last breath. He stepped to the garage door and squinted into the dusk. Headlights cut through the gloaming, low and sharp, carrying the shape of a car he couldn't immediately place. As it rolled closer, the dying engine sputtered like a smoker clearing his lungs. Then it emerged fully from the shadows, a cherry-red vintage sports car, the kind he'd only seen in magazines or on the back row of a collector's auction. The paint still caught the fading light in smooth streaks of fire, but the hood trembled with each misfiring piston. Whoever owned it wasn't treating it like a trophy. The car lurched to a stop in front of his closed sign. For a second, Caleb wondered if he should pretend the shop was shut, but his instinct overruled the thought. He pulled the door wide just as the driver's side opened and a slim figure stepped out. Mrs. Delaney. Silver hair perfectly pinned, soft cardigan draped like a cloud, and the faint scent of cinnamon that always clung to her from years of baking pies for church fundraisers. Of all people, she was the last he expected behind the wheel of such a machine. The car seemed to roar around her even after the engine died, a scarlet beast waiting for its next command. "Evening, Caleb," she said, her voice tight enough to snap. I'm sorry to come so late. The engine started acting up on the highway. It's sputtering, and I need it running tonight." Her eyes darted to the dark road behind her as if something out there might catch up at any moment. Caleb wiped his hands again, though they were already clean, buying a breath to study her. She looked nothing like the calm woman who usually sold pies at Saturday markets. There was a tremor in her fingers, a sharpness in her words. Urgency rolled off her like heat from a hood. "That sounds serious," he said slowly. "Why don't we get it inside before it cools too much?" She nodded, almost too quickly, and he felt a flicker of worry deepen. He slid into the driver's seat and eased the sports car onto the lift, feeling the engine's uneven heartbeat beneath his foot. The interior smelled faintly of gasoline and something unexpected, a sharp, expensive cologne, the kind favored by bikers or men who lived on the road. He didn't mention it. Years of single fatherhood had taught him when to press for answers and when to let silence do the work. Tonight felt like the latter. When he hopped out, Mrs. Delaney stood close, clutching her purse as if it contained something heavier than coins. "I can pay whatever it takes," she blurted. "Cash. Just, please tonight. No notes on the books." Her voice softened, but didn't steady. "It's important." Caleb studied her face in the garage's harsh fluorescent light. The lines around her eyes spoke of decades of kindness and long mornings baking bread, but there was something steely underneath, a hidden story she wasn't ready to tell. He thought of Max upstairs, safe and probably wondering why Dad hadn't come up yet. He thought of the rent notice folded in his wallet and the school field trip money due next week. But beyond money, he felt the quiet tug of instinct, help first, ask later. It was the same instinct that kept him working late when neighbors broke down on the county road, or that had guided him through the lonely years after his wife passed. "All right," he said finally, his voice calm enough to steady them both. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Relief softened her shoulders, but the tension in her eyes remained. As Caleb rolled up his sleeves and lifted the hood, the car exhaled a hot breath of steam and secrets. He told himself this was just another job, a tricky carburetor, maybe a cracked fuel line, but something deeper vibrated beneath the cherry paint and polished chrome, something that made the night air feel charged, like the hush before a storm. Above them, Max's small feet pattered across the apartment floor, a quiet reminder of normal life. Caleb felt the familiar mix of duty and love tighten in his chest. He would fix this car. He would keep his son safe. And whatever story rode in with that scarlet machine and the silver-haired woman at the wheel could wait until the engine ran smooth again. What he couldn't know, what no amount of wrenching or fatherly caution could prepare him for, was how this simple act of kindness would unspool into a night of thunderous engines, long-buried debts, and a brotherhood of bikers bound by a code he had never imagined touching his quiet life. For now, the only sound was the soft metallic ping of cooling steel and the low murmur of a mystery waiting to ignite. Caleb leaned over the open hood, the steady thrum of a shop light above him, casting long shadows across the cherry-red paint. At first glance, the job seemed straightforward, a worn belt, maybe a clogged carburetor, but as his flashlight beam moved deeper into the engine bay, oddities began to stand out. The suspension mounts looked newer than the rest of the car, reinforced with a kind of precision he rarely saw outside racing or law enforcement builds. The engine block itself carried subtle machining marks, like someone had pushed it beyond factory specs. He frowned, tracing a finger along a custom weld that didn't belong to any blueprint he knew. For a moment he forgot Mrs. Delaney was standing just a few feet behind him, until a faint, nervous shuffle of her shoes reminded him she was there. Her presence felt different now. The warm, pie-baking neighbor he knew had been replaced by someone taut with unease. In the harsh fluorescent glow, her silver hair caught flickers of blue, and her clasped hands trembled so slightly he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching closely. "Please," she said softly, but with a surprising edge, "fix it completely. Everything. Tonight. And don't mention to anyone that I was here." The words were careful, deliberate. They hung in the air longer than they should have. Caleb straightened, rag in hand, trying to read her expression. "Not even to the parts supplier if I need something?" he asked gently, half expecting her to laugh off the secrecy. She didn't. Instead, she opened her purse with quick, almost mechanical precision, and pulled out a thick wad of bills bound with a rubber band. The sheer amount startled him. It looked more like something from a high-stakes poker table than the tidy life of a church fundraiser. "I can pay double," she said, pushing the cash forward. "Triple if that's what it takes. Just don't tell anyone. Not even a hint." For a long breath, Caleb didn't move. Every sensible instinct said to slow down, ask more questions. He'd grown up around engines and people, and both had their tells when trouble was brewing. Yet another set of instincts spoke louder. The rent notice folded tight in his wallet, the school letter about Max's upcoming field trip that he'd promised to fund, the thought of groceries running thin by the weekend. He wasn't a man who chased easy money, but tonight wasn't about ease. It was about need. Still, something about the car itself gnawed at him. He circled to the back to inspect the undercarriage and caught the faintest metallic seam near the trunk floor. Kneeling with a flashlight, He discovered a hidden compartment, a reinforced metal box, welded clean into the frame. It was seamless work, the kind usually meant to stay invisible. Smuggling compartment, his mind whispered before he could stop it. He pushed back, telling himself it could just as easily be for emergency tools or a spare battery. But the way the welds gleamed with fresh steel told another story. The air around the car carried its own secrets. Beneath the familiar tang of gasoline and warm rubber was a sharper note. An expensive cologne he couldn't place, the kind that lingered on leather jackets and long highway rides. The mix of scents made him think of roadside bars and midnight runs, places far from the gentle rhythm of Willow Creek. He closed the trunk and faced her again. "This is a lot of work for one night," he said carefully. "Are you sure you want me to tear through it all right now?" "Yes." The answer snapped out before he finished the question. Her eyes, usually soft with neighborly kindness, were fierce and clear. "It has to be tonight." "I can't explain why. Please trust me." Caleb studied her in silence. Trust wasn't something he handed out lightly, not since the years of patching his own heart together after his wife's sudden passing. Yet something in her voice, an old steel under the tremor, felt strangely familiar, the way truth sometimes hides inside urgency. "All right," he said finally, letting the rag fall to the workbench. "I'll take care of it." "You have my word." A visible breath of relief escaped her, though her hand still wouldn't stay still. He offered the next practical question. "It's late. I can drive you home and start on this. Max is upstairs. He'll be fine for a few minutes." The change in her was instant. "No," she said sharply, almost startling herself. Then, softer, "Thank you, but no. I have another place to be." Before he could respond, she pressed the cash into his hand, warm from her grasp, and turned toward the door with surprising speed for someone her age. The bell above the shop door jingled once, twice, and then she was gone, swallowed by the dark street beyond the weak glow of the street lamp. Through the front window, he watched her slip into the night, her cardigan a pale streak against the shadows, and then even that vanished. The shop felt different when the door closed, as if the air itself had thickened. Caleb stared at the money resting heavy in his palm and felt the question settle in his chest like a misfired spark. What kind of quiet grandmother drove a souped-up vintage sports car with hidden compartments and paid in cash for secrecy? He set the bills on the counter, wiped his hands once more, and turned back to the engine. The ticking metal sounded like a clock counting down to something unseen. Upstairs, Max's footsteps moved lightly across the ceiling, a small reminder of normal life, of bedtime stories and school trips and the steady rhythm he fought to protect. Caleb took a deep breath and picked up his wrench. Whatever this night was turning into, he would fix the car as promised. But as the faint scent of gasoline mixed again with that unexplained cologne, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was tightening bolts on a mystery built to run far faster and far stranger than anything he'd ever driven. The garage had settled into that deep middle-of-the-night stillness where every sound seemed to carry its own echo. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above Caleb as he tightened a bolt and listened to the gentle tick of cooling metal. The red sports car loomed like a sleeping animal on the lift, its sleek lines catching stray glimmers of light. Outside, Willow Creek lay silent, the single traffic light blinking its slow red rhythm over an empty street. He should have felt at peace in this quiet hour. He usually did. But tonight there was a restless charge in the air, like the pause before a storm that never quite arrives. Caleb's thoughts slipped, as they often did when his hands were busy and the world was quiet, to the life he'd been rebuilding for 3 years. He could still recall every detail of the day it changed, the hospital's antiseptic smell, the doctor's careful words, the way his wife's hand grew weightless in his. That kind of loss doesn't fade. It simply reshapes you, carving new edges you never asked for. Since that day, everything had narrowed to one clear center, Max. 10 years old and full of stubborn joy, The boy had become the gravity holding Caleb steady. Every decision he made, from the long hours in this drafty garage to the small sacrifices no one else saw, was weighed against Max's needs. Their life wasn't easy, but it had its quiet rituals that stitched the weeks together. Late-night ice cream runs when sleep wouldn't come, fishing trips on misty Sunday mornings when the world still felt half asleep, marathon sessions of monster movies that ended with them laughing under a blanket on the couch. These were the moments that built their little universe. Caleb often told himself that as long as those rituals remained unbroken, they would both be okay. Yet in the solitude of nights like this, a thin thread of worry wound through him. He wondered if love and small traditions were enough to fill the space where a mother's voice should be. He thought about school events where he stood alone among couples, and about the polite pity in neighbors' eyes when they glanced at his grease-stained clothes and thinning wallet. The garage was supposed to be the answer. It wasn't glamorous, just a two-bay workshop that smelled of oil and coffee and old country music, but it kept food on the table, barely. There were months when a single unexpected bill felt like a cliff edge. Tonight's job, though unexpected and strange, felt like a small blessing. The stack of cash Mrs. Delaney had left behind might cover Max's school trip and finally buy the new tires their aging truck desperately needed. Caleb could almost see the relief on his son's face when he heard that the field trip to the Science Museum was no longer a maybe, but a sure thing. Still, as he worked through the layers of that powerful engine, a low unease hummed beneath the gratitude. He replayed Mrs. Delaney's visit, the sharp urgency in her voice, the way her hands trembled, the speed with which she vanished into the night. He thought of the reinforced suspension and the hidden compartment, the faint scent of expensive cologne that didn't belong in a grandmother's car. Every mechanical discovery deepened the riddle. This wasn't a simple repair, it was a machine built for something beyond Sunday drives. The realization kept his heart beating a notch faster than usual, an undercurrent of adrenaline that no amount of reasoning could quiet. He tried to push the questions aside. Work was work. People had their secrets, and not every mystery demanded solving. Maybe she was helping a relative with racing dreams. Maybe she was simply eccentric and wealthy enough to hide her hobbies behind the gentle facade of a pie baker. Caleb had seen stranger things in small towns, where quiet streets often covered complicated lives. And yet the thought wouldn't settle. The smell of gasoline mixed with that foreign cologne felt like a fingerprint left on his mind, something he couldn't wipe clean. Upstairs he heard Max's soft footsteps and the creak of the old floorboards. Probably a bathroom trip or a sip of water. Caleb smiled despite himself, picturing his son rubbing sleepy eyes, unaware that downstairs his father was balancing on the edge of a story neither of them could name. He loved that boy more than he loved his own breath. Every turn of the wrench tonight was for Max. The school trip, the steady rent, the unspoken promise that life would be safe and predictable. The shop clock ticked toward 1 a.m. Caleb wiped his hands and stretched, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders. The red sports car sat gleaming under the overhead lights, beautiful and inscrutable. He reminded himself that he'd done this before, taken on odd jobs, trusted clients to keep their reasons to themselves. But as he set down the wrench and listened to the stillness, the memory of Mrs. Delaney's urgent eyes stayed with him. It was more than curiosity now. It was a faint electric awareness that something larger than a repair bill had entered his world. He turned back to the engine, determined to finish what he'd promised. Yet in the quiet of that garage, surrounded by the smell of oil and the steady beat of his own heart, he knew the night had already shifted something. Whether it was the weight of hidden secrets or the simple pull of fate, he couldn't tell. What he did know was that the life he guarded so carefully, built on small rituals and a father's devotion, had begun to feel less like a closed circle and more like the start of a road he hadn't meant to travel. The engine ticked softly, and beneath it a deeper rhythm stirred, as if the world beyond his garage walls was clearing its throat, ready to speak. The wrench clicked into place with a final, satisfying turn, and Caleb wiped his hands on the same rag he'd been using all night. The garage was silent except for the steady drip of cooling metal and the faint hum of the overhead light. Outside, the town slept under a moonless sky. He glanced at the clock above the workbench, just past midnight. Max would be sound asleep by now, curled under the blanket with his favorite worn-out dinosaur tucked beneath his arm. The thought eased Caleb's shoulders for a moment. This job had taken longer than expected, but the car purred now, a red machine breathing easy after a long night's work. He allowed himself a small, tired smile. Then he heard it. At first it was nothing more than a vibration at the edge of awareness, like distant thunder rolling over the hills. He paused, wrench still in hand, listening. The night beyond the garage doors was calm, no storm clouds, no flicker of lightning on the horizon. The sound came again, low, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat carried on the wind. It wasn't weather. It was something alive, mechanical, and moving closer. Caleb set the wrench down and stepped outside. The air was cool and sharp, scented with pine and faint gasoline from the freshly tuned engine inside. The sound deepened as he crossed the threshold, a low-frequency growl that seemed to vibrate in his chest. He scanned the horizon where the highway cut through dark hills. At first there was only blackness. Then, far off, tiny points of light began to flicker, a dozen at least, maybe more. They moved in a loose line that shimmered and shifted like fireflies in formation. A convoy of trucks was his first thought, but it didn't fit. The lights weren't steady beams, they pulsed and swayed, rising and falling like riders leaning into the wind. And the sound, God, the sound, wasn't the heavy diesel throb of freight engines. This was sharper, rougher, the unmistakable thunder of motorcycles. Not a handful, dozens, maybe scores. Caleb's breath caught. The documentaries he'd half-watched late at night with Max came rushing back, outlaw motorcycle clubs with names like Whispered Warnings, packs that rode like armies. He'd heard them described as storms on wheels. That was exactly how it felt now. The air itself seemed to tighten as the growl grew louder, rolling toward town with relentless rhythm. A creak above him broke the trance. He looked up to see Max framed in the apartment window, his small face pale in the dim light. The boy rubbed his eyes and pressed his forehead to the glass, wide-eyed and confused. "Dad?" his voice called softly, almost lost in the growing roar. "What's that sound?" Caleb forced calm into his voice. "Just some bikes on the highway, buddy. Nothing to worry about. Go back to bed." He raised a reassuring hand, but his heart hammered so hard it nearly drowned his words. Max lingered, unconvinced, eyes locked on the approaching lights. Caleb gave him the firm, fatherly nod that meant the conversation was over. After a moment, the boy disappeared from the window, though Caleb knew he'd probably keep watching from behind the curtain. The rumble was unmistakable now. Engines layered over engines until the night itself vibrated. The points of light multiplied, stretching like a river of sparks. Caleb felt the hair on his arms lift as he counted and lost count again. 50, 60, more? They were closing in fast, and the quiet little town seemed to hold its breath, as if the whole landscape sensed what was coming. He turned back to the garage and instinctively checked the locks, every movement quick and precise. The red sports car gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a guilty secret. He thought of Mrs. Delaney's trembling hands, the hidden compartment, the faint scent of cologne that didn't belong. A realization pressed against the edge of his mind, something too large to name, yet impossible to ignore. This wasn't random. The timing, the urgency, the money, all of it fit together in a way that made his stomach knot. The roar grew until the ground itself seemed to pulse. The first shapes emerged from the darkness, black silhouettes with chrome flashing under the street lamps, wheels kicking up sparks as they slowed. Headlights cut through the night in staggered rhythm, illuminating leather jackets, heavy boots, and the unmistakable patchwork of club insignias. The lead rider raised a gloved hand, and the formation shifted with seamless discipline, an army on two wheels moving as one. Caleb's breath shortened. He had fixed hundreds of cars in this garage, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of an entire biker convoy descending on his quiet corner of Willow Creek. He told himself again that they might just be passing through, but the lie fell flat in the face of the precise turn they made, every bike leaning toward his street. They weren't passing, they were arriving. Somewhere above, Max's shadow moved against the curtain. Caleb prayed his son couldn't feel the fear that now sat heavy in the air, the sense that the town itself was holding still, waiting to see what would break the silence first. The distant thunder had become a living wall of sound, and as the first bikes rolled into view, engines snarling under the streetlight, Caleb felt the quiet world he'd built begin to tilt, as if a single night could rewrite everything he thought he knew about safety, about secrets, about the gentle life he'd been fighting so hard to protect. The first bikes crested the hill like a rising tide of steel and thunder, a metallic wave spilling into the sleeping town. Headlights cut sharp angles through the darkness, white beams that flickered across rooftops and telephone poles, then swept down to spear the small garage at the edge of Willow Creek. Chrome gleamed in quick flashes under a thin slice of moon, each reflection a warning flare. The sound was overwhelming now, hundreds of engines beating in layered rhythm until the ground itself seemed to pulse with their arrival. Caleb stood at the garage door, every muscle drawn tight. The night smelled of hot oil and wet asphalt. He had locked the shop earlier out of habit, but that simple click of metal now felt like paper against a flood. Upstairs, a faint creak told him Max was awake and moving again. "Stay in your room," Caleb called up, voice steadier than he felt. "Don't come down." No matter what. He listened for the quick answering "okay," and when it came, small and tight, he felt both relief and a deeper fear. His son trusted him to make the world safe, and at this moment Caleb wasn't sure he could. The roar outside deepened into something primal as the first riders swung off the road and onto the gravel lot. Their bikes glowed like restless predators under the weak streetlight, long frames, heavy engines, pipes that threw back the moonlight in sudden sparks. One by one they fanned out until nearly 100 machines encircled the garage, engines still idling in low growls that never quite synchronized. It wasn't chaos, it was control disguised as menace, a choreography of power. The air thickened with the mixed scent of gasoline, leather, and cold metal. Caleb's breath shortened as his eyes adjusted. The riders were clad in dark jackets heavy with patches, everyone stitched with the unmistakable winged skull of the Hells Angels. The design caught the light in hard flashes of red and white. He had seen that emblem only in documentaries and news reports, always paired with words like notorious and outlaw. Now it wasn't a picture on a screen, it was a living circle around his livelihood and his son's bedroom. He felt his heart hammer against his ribs, each beat a sharp reminder that there was nowhere to run. The noise cut suddenly when the lead rider raised a gloved hand. Engines dropped to a low, throbbing murmur, the silence inside the sound more unnerving than the roar that preceded it. From the front of the pack, a tall figure dismounted with deliberate grace. He was broad-shouldered, his leather jacket creasing like armor as he moved. A scar ran in a pale slash from his cheekbone to his jaw, and a thick braid of dark hair hung beneath his helmet strap. He took his time removing the helmet, shaking out the braid with a slow, unhurried motion that felt more like ceremony than necessity. Caleb's mouth had gone dry. He backed toward the service counter and double-checked the deadbolt on the front door, though he knew a lock meant little to 100 men who traveled like an army. The stranger walked toward the glass entrance, boots crunching on gravel with steady weight. Behind him, the others waited without words, their posture almost military, not a single engine revved. It was as if the night itself was waiting for his next step. The man stopped inches from the door. For a moment, He simply looked inside, eyes dark and unreadable under the fringe of his brow. Then he lifted a leather-gloved hand and knocked, once, twice, each strike deep and measured, like a judge calling a court to order. The sound reverberated through the small building, a quiet authority that made Caleb's heart lurch. "Caleb Mason?" The man's voice carried easily through the glass, low and resonant, a strange mix of command and respect. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The sound of his own name from a stranger's mouth chilled Caleb more than the night air. He hadn't given it. He hadn't even turned on the open sign. His mind scrambled for explanations. License plate records, gossip at the diner, a chance meeting he'd forgotten, but nothing fit the precision of this moment. Upstairs, Max's shadow flickered against the window curtain. Caleb forced himself to look calm, to be the father his son believed he was. "Go back, Max," he called, keeping his eyes on the door. "It's okay." Just stay put. He hoped the boy couldn't hear the tremor he couldn't quite hide. The rider waited, motionless, his breath clouding faintly in the chill. Behind him, the bikes rumbled in unison, like a distant storm held in place. Caleb's thoughts flashed to Mrs. Delaney, the trembling hands, the hidden compartment in the car, the smell of expensive cologne that clung to the interior like a secret. Every odd detail of the evening rearranged itself into a sharper pattern, and with it came the sudden, undeniable sense that the night was no accident. He stepped closer to the door until only the glass separated them. "That's me," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "What do you want?" The man with the scar didn't answer right away. He studied Caleb with the measured patience of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When he finally spoke, his words were deliberate, each one carrying weight. "We need to talk about the woman who brought you that car." The garage seemed to shrink around him. Caleb felt the thrum of engines vibrating through the floorboards, felt the cold sweat along his spine, felt the unspoken promise in those words that whatever story had begun with a simple late-night repair was only now revealing its true scale. In the stillness that followed, he understood that nothing in his quiet life would ever be quite the same. The man with the scar let the silence hang for a long beat, the steady pulse of idling motorcycles filling the night like a slow drumline. Then he reached for the glass door and pushed it gently until the hinges gave a soft groan. "Name's Bear," he said, his voice carrying that gravelly calm of someone used to being heard the first time. "We're not here to break anything. We're looking for Delaney." The way he said the name, measured, careful, made it sound heavier than a simple surname. Caleb's breath snagged. Delaney. His thoughts darted to the silver-haired woman who had slipped into the night only hours ago, leaving behind a powerful engine, a hidden compartment, and a promise of secrecy. He tasted the metallic edge of worry in his mouth and forced his voice to stay steady. "Delaney who?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Bear only tilted his head slightly, eyes steady, saying nothing more. Behind him, the circle of riders stayed silent, their bikes rumbling low and even. Not a single voice rose, not a helmet tilted. They stood like sentinels, each man a dark outline against the pale moonlight. There was no restless shifting, no careless revving of engines. The discipline felt almost military, as if every man knew his place and no command needed to be spoken twice. Caleb sensed that if Bear gave a single nod, the entire circle could ignite in motion like a single body. "You know her," Bear finally said, not as a question but as a statement wrapped in certainty. "The lady carries our history." The phrase landed like a spark in dry grass. Caleb's mind raced through images that didn't fit together. Mrs. Delaney kneading bread at a church fundraiser, her kind laugh at the market, the quiet strength behind her trembling hands when she asked him to keep silent. History. What kind of history would bind an elderly neighbor to 100 leather-clad riders at midnight? He wiped his palms on his jeans, stalling for time. Every instinct as a mechanic told him to diagnose before acting, but this wasn't an engine he could dismantle with a wrench. "She came by with a car," he admitted carefully. I fix cars. That's what I do. Bear studied him in silence. The scar on his cheek caught the fluorescent glow from inside the shop, a pale reminder of some old fight. She trusted you with that machine, he said at last. Means something. Caleb's heart thudded hard enough to feel in his throat. He thought of the envelope in her glove box, the reinforced suspension, the smell of gasoline mixed with cologne that spoke of roads longer than Willow Creek's quiet lanes. Had she been one of them once? A rider? Maybe even a leader? The idea was so far from the Mrs. Delaney, he knew that it almost made him laugh, except nothing about Bear's presence suggested a joke. You keep saying history, Caleb pressed. What does that mean? Bear's gaze softened just enough to let a hint of story slip through. Long ago, he said, there was a run gone bad. Men bleeding out on a cold road. Someone stepped in, someone who could ride and heal and keep men alive when every minute counted. She pulled us back from the edge more than once. She's family, even if she doesn't wear the patch. He paused, his voice lowering into something like reverence. We owe her more than we can ever repay. Tonight we need to talk to her. Old debts, old promises. The words washed over Caleb like a strange tide. Danger and loyalty, violence and care all braided together. He could almost see her as Bear described, younger, fierce, leather jacket catching wind, hands steady in chaos. It explained the hidden compartment, the modifications built for speed and survival. But why now? Why tonight? A faint creak above reminded him of Max. He pictured his son crouched behind the curtain, eyes wide and trusting, and felt the weight of two conflicting loyalties settle in his chest. He'd given Mrs. Delaney his word to keep her visit quiet. Yet here was a man who spoke of life debts and brotherhood, who carried himself with a gravity that made violence seem like the last, not the first option. Caleb knew the difference between threat and conviction. What he saw in Bear was something closer to honor, hard-edged, but real. The motorcycles idled on, their combined vibration a low heartbeat in the gravel lot. The smell of fuel hung thick in the air, mingling with the cool scent of pine from the hills beyond. Caleb's fingers tightened around the doorframe as he searched for the right path between trust and truth. If he said nothing, he might be protecting a woman who didn't want to be found, or he might be leaving her exposed to a danger he couldn't see. If he spoke, he might betray her confidence, but also give her allies a chance to keep a promise made decades ago. Bear seemed to read the turmoil without needing words. He stepped a fraction closer, voice softening. We mean her no harm. We only keep our word. That's all. The rest of the riders stayed motionless, the discipline of their silence somehow louder than any threat could have been. Caleb exhaled slowly, feeling the night press in around him. The garage that usually smelled of grease and safety now felt like a place where the past and present were folding together, forcing choices he'd never imagined making. He thought of Mrs. Delaney's steady eyes when she'd asked him to trust her. He thought of the hidden medallion on her dashboard, the faint scent of a life she hadn't shared. And he thought of Max, asleep just a thin wooden floor away, depending on him to keep the world steady. The decision wasn't simple, and it wasn't finished. But as Bear waited, the rumble of engines a living reminder of promises older than Caleb's worries, he understood that whatever he chose would pull him and his quiet life deeper into a story that had started long before tonight. Bear seemed to read the weight behind Caleb's silence. He stepped closer to the door, the leather of his jacket creaking in the quiet, and let his voice drop until it carried the intimacy of a confidant rather than the force of a stranger. Listen, he said, each word deliberate. This isn't about violence. We're not here to start something or scare your boy. We're here because of a promise, a long one. Older than most of the men out there, his eyes held Caleb's with a steadiness that was impossible to look away from. If we don't find her tonight, we fail someone who once saved every one of us in ways you can't imagine. The phrase settled in Caleb's chest like a second heartbeat. A promise. That explained the discipline, the silence, the way the riders waited without a single careless reverence. He'd expected threats, maybe a demand for money or a hidden package. Instead, he heard something that sounded uncomfortably like devotion. Bear drew in a slow breath, as if measuring how much to reveal, then began to speak with the care of someone unfolding a memory that still carried heat. Decades back, before I was born, there was a run from New Mexico to the Canadian border. My old man was on it. They called it the Iron Cross. Things went bad. Territory disputes, ambushes, men shot and bleeding on empty roads, no medics, no one the law would protect. They'd have died out there, if not for a woman they called Iron Grace. His voice softened on the name, rough edges giving way to something close to reverence. She rode hard, patched wounds with nothing but grit and what she carried in her saddlebags. She negotiated ceasefires with crews that would have killed each other before sunrise. They lived because of her. Caleb felt his breath stall. Iron Grace. The name had the burn of legend, like something whispered in bars where old riders nursed long grudges and longer memories. He tried to fit the image into the quiet silhouette of Mrs. Delaney, flour-dusted apron, gentle hands passing out slices of pie at the church fair. The two pictures wouldn't merge. Yet flashes from the last hours began to rearrange themselves. The urgency in her eyes, the steady command beneath the tremor in her voice, the hidden compartment welded with such precision. Maybe the life she'd let them all see had been a careful second draft. Bear went on, his voice carrying the hum of distant engines like a second accompaniment. My father told me once that Iron Grace didn't just save lives. She saved whole chapters of this club's history. Without her, the Angels might have splintered into war. He made me promise that if she ever called or if word of her surfaced again, I'd be there to repay that debt. Tonight, that's what we're doing. Legacy and closure. Nothing else. The night pressed in tighter. Caleb's mind raced, colliding with every story he'd quietly believed about Mrs. Delaney. A gentle widow who baked pies and volunteered at the library, a secret rider who had once stared down men with guns and talked them into peace. Maybe both could be true. Maybe he'd only known the surface of the woman living a few streets away. Bear took another step closer until the light from inside the shop lit the scar on his cheek in pale relief. "We owe her everything," he said simply. "If we don't keep this promise, we're not the men our fathers believed we could be. We have to speak with her tonight. For her, for the ones who didn't make it, for what she built." Caleb stood with his back to the counter, the faint tick of the sports car cooling behind him like a metronome for his thoughts. He pictured Max upstairs, small and trusting, a boy whose world rested on his father's quiet choices. He pictured Mrs. Delaney slipping into the darkness with that quick, purposeful stride, carrying secrets heavier than any bag of flour. His promise to her echoed in his mind, keep her visit quiet. Yet what Bear offered wasn't a threat. It was a history written in blood and gratitude. He rubbed his palms on his jeans, trying to ground himself. "You're asking me to break a trust," he said finally. She wanted no one to know. Bear's gaze didn't waver. "I'm asking you to help fulfill one. We won't force her to come back. We only need to stand in front of her and tell her that every road we ride is because she once stood between chaos and death. We need her to know we remember. That's all." The words hung in the air, heavy with a sincerity Caleb couldn't dismiss. He thought of the way Mrs. Delaney had gripped the steering wheel when she arrived, the brief flash of something steely in her eyes, as if she knew a reckoning was near and had chosen to face it on her own terms. Maybe this meeting wasn't danger. Maybe it was the ending she had been driving toward all along. Caleb exhaled, the decision only half-formed but inevitable. "I can't give you anything tonight," he said slowly, "except this. I'll listen. You tell me everything, every reason she matters, and then I'll decide what I can share. I won't betray her without knowing what I'm stepping into." Bear studied him for a long moment, then gave a single solemn nod. "Fair enough." We wait, and we talk. Behind him the riders didn't move, their engines humming like a distant oath. The night no longer felt like a siege. It felt like a threshold. Caleb glanced at the red sports car, at the shadows of the men outside, and at the stairs leading to Max. He still didn't know which way the road would bend, but he sensed that by morning he'd either have protected a secret or helped complete a promise forged long before he turned his first wrench. Somewhere beyond the hills, a woman named Iron Grace was out there, carrying the weight of a history he'd only just begun to understand. The garage had gone unnervingly still, the roar of the engines outside replaced by a low, patient idle that seeped through the walls like a distant heartbeat. Caleb stood in that quiet pocket of light, Bear's words about legacy and debt echoing in his mind. He should have been satisfied with what he'd heard, but something in him kept reaching for a firmer answer. Every mechanic knows when a machine still hides a problem, and tonight his gut told him there was more beneath the surface of this car, more than custom welds and reinforced suspension. He turned toward the sports car, its red paint gleaming under the fluorescent bulbs like a secret wrapped in metal. The smell of warm oil and faint cologne lingered, stirring a restless curiosity he could no longer ignore. He slipped into the driver's seat, the leather cool and supple, and stared at the dash. Something about the glove box tugged at him, a quiet insistence that wouldn't let go. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Delaney's eyes had flicked toward it when she spoke, or maybe it was pure instinct, the same intuition that told him when an engine was about to seize before the gauges ever warned him. The latch clicked open with a soft metallic sigh. Inside, beneath a stack of registration papers and an old road map, lay a sealed envelope the color of parchment. The handwriting across the front was neat but firm, addressed to the Brothers of the Open Road. His heart kicked hard. The name sounded less like a club and more like a vow. Hand suddenly heavy, he broke the seal. A faint whiff of leather and old paper escaped, carrying a whisper of decades past. The first thing he saw was a black and white photograph. The woman in it stopped him cold. She was younger, maybe in her 30s, but there was no mistaking the calm eyes and high cheekbones. Mrs. Delaney, though here she was transformed. Dressed in a dark leather jacket and heavy boots, she stood beside a row of gleaming bikes under a wide western sky, wind pushing loose strands of hair across her face. She wasn't smiling, yet she radiated a quiet command, like someone who knew chaos and had learned to bend it into order. Caleb turned the photo over and found a single line written in a tight hand. Iron Grace, 1979. The name Bear had spoken was no myth. Beneath the photograph lay a folded sheet of paper, its creases worn soft from being opened and closed many times. He unfolded it carefully. The letter inside was direct and unadorned, the words shaped by someone who'd lived long on the road and longer in truth. "Brothers," it began, "if this reaches you, I have one last ride to finish. There are promises left to keep, and children who need what we once vowed to protect. Should I not return, know that I've placed a trust fund for the orphans of our fallen, money set aside from years of quiet work and quiet miles. Guard it, guard each other, and remember the peace we fought to make possible." The final line chilled him. "If I don't come back, consider this my final call for your protection, not for me, but for what we started." Caleb sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. The weight of the secret pressed down heavier than any engine block he had ever lifted. Mrs. Delaney hadn't just been a medic or a negotiator. She had been the keeper of a living promise, carrying the memory of lost riders and the children left behind. And now, all these years later, she was moving once more into danger, alone, without asking for help, except in the quiet way of a sealed envelope and a hope that someone would someday open it. When he stepped out of the car, the night air felt sharper, cleaner. Bear was waiting just beyond the threshold, the dim garage light catching the scar on his cheek like a pale signature. Caleb held out the letter and photograph without a word. Bear accepted them with a reverence Caleb hadn't expected. He unfolded the letter and read silently, his face shifting as the words sank in. The hard lines around his eyes softened, the stern set of his jaw easing into something almost tender. When he looked back up, there was a depth in his gaze that spoke of gratitude and grief intertwined. "This is her," he said quietly. "Iron Grace. I thought maybe it was only stories my father told, but this—" He tapped the page with a leather-gloved finger. "This is proof. She's still keeping the oath when most of us barely remember it." The surrounding bikes continued to rumble like restless animals, but the tension that had hung over the lot began to thin. A few riders exchanged brief glances, the kind men give each other when old legends suddenly walk back into the present. Bear drew a long breath, folding the letter with deliberate care as if the paper itself carried a heartbeat. "She's risking herself again," he said, almost to himself, "for the kids who never got their fathers back. For the peace she made and paid for." He met Caleb's eyes. "That's why we have to reach her tonight. Not to drag her back, to stand with her if the road turns bad." Caleb felt a quiet awe settle over his fear. In his hands he had held a bridge between past and present, proof that the quiet woman who sold pies at the farmer's market had once been the fierce center of a world most people only imagined in outlaw ballads. He thought of Max asleep above them, of the values he tried to teach in small, daily lessons. Keep your word, protect the vulnerable, finish what you start. Without knowing it, Mrs. Delaney had been living those same truths on a scale far beyond pies and PTA meetings. He nodded slowly, the decision forming without force. The night had begun with a strange car and unanswered questions, but now it carried the weight of a mission that felt larger than fear. The woman who had asked for silence had also left a call for help hidden in plain sight, a message meant to find the right hands when the time came. Caleb looked at Bear and the silent ring of riders beyond him and felt something like purpose click into place, as clean and certain as a bolt tightened to spec. The night outside the garage had the color of steel, a hard, polished black that caught the faintest starlight. Caleb stood just beyond the open door with the letter still alive in his mind, while Bear laid out the next truth as plainly as a mechanic pointing to a cracked belt. "She's heading for Iron Creek Pass," Bear said. "It used to be a rendezvous spot back when my father rode. Neutral ground. But word is some old rivals have been sniffing around, maybe looking to claim it. We were planning a memorial ride at dawn for the brothers we've lost. If those men are there first, it could turn bad, real bad." The name Iron Creek Pass felt heavy even without knowing the road. Caleb pictured jagged cliffs and forgotten trails, a place built for the kind of meeting where police lights never arrived on time. Mrs. Delaney, with her quiet strength and hidden history, was driving straight toward it. "I'm coming with you," Caleb said before the thought had a chance to cool. The words surprised even him, but they settled like a gear, dropping cleanly into place. Bear studied him in the low light. "It isn't a safe run. We don't know what we'll find. You have a boy upstairs who needs you home." "I know," Caleb answered, the resolve in his voice even surprising himself. "That's exactly why I have to go. She trusted me with that car, with that letter. If something happens and I stayed behind, I'd never be able to explain to Max why I didn't help." He looked toward the apartment window where a thin glow hinted that Max might still be awake, watching. "I'll make sure he's safe first. Then I ride." Bear's scarred face softened with something like respect. "You're his kind of man," he said quietly, meaning Iron Grace. "Make it quick." Caleb ran upstairs 2 steps at a time, the sound of idling motorcycles following like a deep echo. Max was waiting at the top of the stairs in pajama pants, eyes wide and bright with questions he hadn't dared ask. Caleb dropped to one knee, the smell of engine grease and night air still clinging to his jacket. "I have to help someone, buddy," he said, keeping his voice calm. "It's important. I need you to stay with Mrs. Holbrook next door until I get back. I promise I'll be back by morning." Max clutched his father's sleeve, a silent plea in the small pressure of his fingers. "Is it dangerous?" Caleb forced a smile, smoothing the boy's hair. "Not the kind you think. I just have to make sure a friend is safe, that's all. You know how we keep our promises, right? Tonight, that's what I'm doing, keeping a promise." The boy nodded slowly, trusting without fully understanding, and Caleb's heart ached with both pride and fear. He gathered Max's overnight bag and walked him across the narrow lot to the neighbor's porch, the roar of 100 motorcycles like a restless tide behind him. Mrs. Holbrook opened the door in her robe, worry flickering in her eyes, but no questions asked. She'd known Caleb since he was a teenager and recognized the urgency in his voice. "I'll watch him," she said simply. Back at the garage, the riders were ready, their engines rumbling in a steady rhythm that felt more like a heartbeat than noise. Bear waited beside a massive touring bike fitted with a sidecar. He handed Caleb a helmet, black and glossy, the inside still warm, from a rider's head. "Ride with me," he said. "It's safer and faster." Caleb climbed in, the unfamiliar weight of the helmet settling over him like a vow. The sidecar's seat smelled of leather and long miles. He tightened the strap under his chin and gave a short nod. Bear swung onto the bike, twisted the throttle, and the machine answered with a deep growl that rolled through Caleb's chest. With a single raised hand, Bear signaled the convoy. Engines flared in perfect unison. The air filled with a metallic symphony of 100 exhaust pipes, a sound that seemed to shake loose every loose screw of the night. The column moved as one organism, pulling out of the lot and onto the dark county road in a fluid, disciplined surge. Gravel spat behind them like sparks from a forge. Wind tore through Caleb's jacket as soon as they hit open road. The night smelled of pine and cold metal, of gasoline and old stories. Stars streaked above in frozen silence, while the ground below blurred into a dark river of speed. Fear pressed against his ribs with each mile, a sharp reminder that he had left the world of schedules and rent notices and stepped into something older, something bound by oaths instead of laws. He glanced over his shoulder and caught the sight of the riders fanned out behind them, two tight columns of headlamps carving white ribbons across the hills. Every man kept perfect distance, signaling with small flicks of a hand or a boot, no words needed. It was a language of motion, precise and unyielding. Caleb felt the thrum of it through the sidecar floor and realized he was witnessing a world with its own laws, where loyalty was the currency and silence the rulebook. Somewhere out ahead, hidden in the folds of dark mountains, Mrs. Delaney was driving toward a place that sounded more like legend than geography. Iron Creek Pass. Even the name felt forged from danger and memory. Caleb pictured her at the wheel, hair silver in the dashlight, carrying that letter's last request into the unknown. He tightened his grip on the side of the car as the bike leaned hard into a curve, the tires humming like a vow. He thought of Max in the neighbor's spare bed, of the promise to return by dawn. It felt fragile against the roar of engines and the cold sweep of wind, but it was the anchor he held to. He didn't know what waited at the pass, rival gangs, empty roads, or something stranger, but he knew why he was there. A woman named Iron Grace had trusted him without words, and a boy named Max trusted him without question. Tonight, on a road that shimmered like black glass under the stars, those trusts were the same thing, and he would ride them both until the morning found him. The highway opened before them like a black ribbon pulled taut across the hills, moonlight brushing silver along its edges. Caleb crouched lower in the sidecar as Bear leaned into the throttle and the machine surged forward, the deep growl of the engine blending with the rolling thunder of 100 bikes behind them. The night air struck his face in cool waves, sharp with pine and the sweet, bitter tang of gasoline. Each breath felt alive, heavy with speed and something wilder he couldn't name. The convoy held tight formation, two sweeping lines of chrome and leather that moved as though they shared a single heartbeat. Caleb watched the riders ahead and behind, marveling at their silent choreography. A flick of a boot meant tighten the line. A gloved hand raised and curled meant slow the throttle. Sometimes a quick double rev of an engine sent a message rippling through the group faster than words could carry. No one shouted. No one broke rhythm. The road belonged to them, and they moved across it like a living river of steel. Bear's voice cut through the roar, low but clear, through the calm in Caleb's borrowed helmet. "What you're seeing," he said, "isn't just a ride. It's a memorial. Every mile tonight is for a brother who never made it home. Every silence is for a promise we swore to keep. We ride because they can't." He glanced back briefly, eyes catching the starlight. "And because she made sure we could." The words found their mark. Caleb imagined Mrs. Delaney, iron grace, years younger, riding at the head of a column like this, her steady hand stitching peace between men who only knew war. He understood why Bear's men spoke of her as if she were more myth than memory. He also understood for the first time why she might have buried that part of herself beneath aprons and church socials. A life like this carried a gravity that never let go. Maybe the only way to keep it from consuming everything was to hide it so completely that even neighbors and friends would never guess. The deeper they rode into the mountains, the more the world narrowed to the hum of tires and the cold perfume of forest air. The moon climbed higher, carving silver streaks across the asphalt. Occasionally, Caleb caught glimpses of wildlife startled by the sudden parade. A deer frozen at the tree line, an owl wheeling silently overhead. The night felt both endless and immediate. Every mile a meditation and a challenge. Bear spoke again, his words weaving with the engine's pulse. "We live by a code," he said. "Brotherhood above all. You watch the man beside you because someday he might have to drag you out of a ditch or shield you from a bullet. You settle debts. You keep your word. And if someone saves your life, someone like her, you remember until the road ends." Caleb listened in silence, feeling the depth of that commitment. It wasn't law in the way courts and contracts defined it. It was older, closer to the vows that hold a family together, the unspoken bond that had kept him and Max afloat after his wife died. He felt an unexpected kinship with these men, their leather and scars not so different from the grease and late nights that had shaped his own quiet world. Each had built a life around promises that outsiders might never understand. Yet beneath the rising respect, a steady current of fear kept his senses sharp. Iron Creek Pass was still miles away, hidden somewhere in the folds of dark mountains. Bear's talk of rivals, men willing to reclaim old grudges, echoed like a warning. Caleb pictured Mrs. Delaney out there alone, her silver hair lit by dashboard glow, and wondered if she had already crossed paths with whoever threatened the memorial ride. The thought tightened his chest. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the possibility of violence or the idea that he might arrive too late to matter. The convoy began to climb, the road twisting into higher country where the air thinned and sharpened. Engines downshifted in a seamless ripple, their exhausts barking in unison as they leaned into each curve. Caleb felt the centrifugal pull in his ribs and gripped the sidecar frame, adrenaline sparking through every nerve. Around them, the forest thickened, pines standing like dark sentinels against a sky now crowded with stars. The scent of sap and cold stone mixed with the persistent undertone of burning fuel. It smelled like memory and motion, like something ancient wrapped in steel. Bear raised his left arm, fingers flicking through a sequence Caleb couldn't decipher, but the riders obeyed instantly. The columns tightened, headlights drawing closer until the group felt like a single machine with 100 pistons. The sound of their engines became one great chord, low and resonant, as if the road itself were humming with them. Caleb had never experienced such unity, not even in the long, quiet days of working side by side with his late wife in the garage. This was something else, an organism born of trust and speed, where every man surrendered a piece of himself to protect the whole. As the pass drew nearer, the landscape grew wilder. Cliffs loomed on one side, sheer and pale in the moonlight. On the other, black pines plunged into valleys so deep they seemed bottomless. The road narrowed until it felt like a ribbon balanced on air. Caleb's breath quickened with the sense that they were riding not just toward a place, but toward an old story waiting to be told in firelight and risk. He glanced at Bear, whose posture never wavered. The man looked as much a part of the bike as the engine itself, every movement controlled and deliberate. Caleb wondered what Bear's father had told him on their rides, how many miles of grief and pride had been compressed into the legacy of a single name, Iron Grace. He thought again of Mrs. Delaney and the letter hidden in the glove box, a trust fund for children who would never see their fathers again, and felt the echo of something bigger than his own life, a promise made across decades and still alive in the rumble beneath his feet. But the deeper they climbed, the more another truth pressed against him. They were heading toward a confrontation he couldn't predict. Rival gangs, old vendettas, or something darker than either might be waiting where the road ended. The thought tightened like a cold fist around his heart. Still, he didn't ask to turn back. He couldn't. Somewhere ahead, a woman who once called herself Iron Grace was keeping her last appointment with history, and Caleb knew he had chosen to ride into whatever waited at Iron Creek Pass, because promises, once taken, have their own gravity, and because loyalty, whether to blood or to honor, demands nothing less. The convoy wound through the final bend of the mountain road and slowed to a rolling hush. Iron Creek Pass lay ahead, a clearing washed in moonlight where pines opened onto a plateau of cold earth and silent stones. Caleb felt the vibration of the engines fade to a low tremor as Bear raised his hand and brought the formation to a stop. Beyond the tree line, an old wooden cabin stood in quiet defiance of time. Its roof bowed slightly, and its windows lit with a soft, golden glow. There, beside the weathered porch rail, rested a cherry-red sports car that gleamed like a signal flare in the dark. Mrs. Delaney's car. She had made it here hours before them. Caleb climbed stiffly from the sidecar, his legs buzzing from the long ride. The air smelled of cold pine and wood smoke, with a faint metallic edge that reminded him of forgotten tools in a shed. Every sense felt sharpened. He noticed how the bikers dismounted without a single shout, their movements precise and deliberate. As if this ground demanded respect, helmets came off in silence. Leather jackets creaked softly. The night itself seemed to bow. Bear motioned for Caleb to follow and pushed open the cabin door. Warmth spilled out, along with a faint scent of burning candles and something older, leather, maybe, or memories steeped in dust. Inside, the room was alive with a gentle light. Candles flickered in 100 small flames along shelves and sills, their glow dancing over a wall covered floor to ceiling in photographs. Caleb stopped in the doorway, caught by the sheer gravity of it. Black and white snapshots of young men with wind-blown hair and road-worn smiles. Polaroids of chrome bikes lined up under wide skies. Color prints of club gatherings that spanned decades. Some faces were crossed with a single line of black ribbon. Others bore names written carefully along the margins. It was a map of lives lived fast and often cut short. At the center of it all stood Mrs. Delaney. No apron, no cardigan. Just a dark riding jacket that fit her as naturally as the gentle authority in her posture. The silver of her hair glowed in the candlelight like a crown. When the first of the riders stepped inside, she didn't startle, didn't even turn quickly. She smiled as though she had been expecting them all along. Her eyes found Bear immediately. "Matthew," she said. Using a name that seemed to pull him back through time, "I wondered how long it would take you." Bear froze for half a heartbeat, the hard edges of his presence softening. "No one's called me that since my father," he said quietly. The scar on his cheek looked different now, less a warning, more a relic. Mrs. Delaney stepped forward, her boots soundless on the old floorboards. "Your father was a good man," she said, voice carrying both strength and sorrow. "He and I patched up more wounds than I can count. Do you remember when he told the story of the Broken Arrow Run?" Bear nodded, his eyes reflecting the candles. "We ended that war with words instead of bullets," she continued. "People forget what courage that took. It wasn't just the men with the bikes who kept the peace. It was those who could stand between them and talk them down." Caleb listened, hardly breathing. The woman he'd known as a gentle baker was speaking like someone who had once held the power to stop bloodshed with a single conversation. She moved along the wall of photographs, touching a few with the back of her fingers. "These are the brothers we lost," she said. "Some to crashes, some to violence, some to the slow drift of time. But all of them were part of a dream we built on the open road, that freedom could mean loyalty, that family could be chosen and held together by honor instead of fear." Her gaze swept the room, landing on Bear and then on Caleb. "When I left that life, I thought the work was done. But promises have long lives. There are orphans who still need the fund we planned, families who deserve to know we remember. I came here tonight because the memorial ride must go on, and because the trust we created can't vanish with me. I need you to keep it alive." Her tone never broke. There was no hint of pleading, only certainty, as though she were passing a torch that had burned steadily for decades. Bear lowered his head, the gesture more profound than words. Around him, the other riders stood silent, the rumble of their presence giving way to something like reverence. Caleb felt the air thicken with meaning. He had spent hours turning wrenches and balancing bills, believing those were the quiet acts that kept a life intact. But here was a woman who had balanced entire worlds, violence and peace, freedom and duty, without anyone in town ever knowing. He thought of Max, of the lessons he tried to teach in small, everyday ways about keeping promises and standing up for what matters. Tonight he was watching those lessons embodied in a woman who had lived them on roads far more dangerous than his own. Awe pressed against his chest until he could barely speak. Mrs. Delaney turned to him with a gentle smile, as if she could see his thoughts forming. "You kept your word, Caleb," she said. "That matters more than you know. This isn't about the road we rode back then. It's about the lives we can still change now." Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with an enduring calm that felt stronger than any storm. Candles flickered as a soft mountain wind slipped through the old boards, making the photographs tremble like spirits eager to join the conversation. Caleb felt as if the past itself had risen to fill the room. Brothers long gone, rides long finished, promises still alive. He stood among strangers and yet felt part of something vast and unbroken. In that quiet cabin, surrounded by ghosts of the open road, he understood why Mrs. Delaney had hidden this side of her life. It wasn't shame. It was a devotion so deep it needed the shelter of silence. Now, as she handed the weight of her unfinished work to the men who had once ridden with her and to a mechanic who had stumbled into their story, Caleb felt the humbling certainty that he was witnessing a kind of history few people ever touched, a history carried not in books or headlines, but in the living hearts of those who refused to forget. The cabin was a sanctuary of low candlelight and murmured memories when the new sound reached them. It began as a faint tremor beneath the floorboards, subtle enough to seem like a passing gust at first. Then it grew, gathering weight, until the wooden walls shivered with a rhythm far too deliberate to be wind. Caleb felt it in his chest before he understood it with his ears, a slow building growl that climbed into the unmistakable roar of engines. Bear's head snapped toward the door. Around the room the riders stiffened, their easy posture dissolving into alert stillness. The warmth of reunion fell away like a dropped curtain. Outside, the night that had seemed so still moments ago erupted with light. Headlamps cut across the trees in sharp white slices. Gravel popped and hissed under heavy tires. The sound wasn't one or two bikes, but many, a swarm approaching with the same precision the Hells Angels had shown on the road. Caleb's pulse quickened. He thought of Max, safe with Mrs. Holbrook, grateful now for every instinct that had sent him there. Bear moved to the window and looked out, his face tightening in recognition. "Raven Lords," he said, barely more than a breath. The name hung in the air like a struck match. Several of the older riders exchanged looks heavy with old history. Caleb caught the flicker of leather vests outside, dark patches marked with a black bird in flight. The rival club that Bear's father had once warned about, the same crew rumored to stir trouble whenever memorial rides or peace pacts were mentioned. The cabin door rattled once under a firm knock, then swung open before anyone could answer. A man stepped inside, flanked by three others. He was broad and sharp-eyed, a gray streak cutting through his dark beard, and he carried the air of someone who preferred demands to introductions. "This is our pass tonight," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "You don't ride here without paying respect. Or paying up." He swept a cold glance across the room, letting it rest an extra beat on Bear. Territory isn't free. Memories don't buy it. The air thickened until Caleb could hear his own heartbeat. Several angels shifted their weight, hands hovering near belts and jackets where weapons might hide. The Raven men mirrored the motion, the tension crackling like an exposed wire. The smell of cold metal mixed with candle wax. It was the kind of silence that could shatter in a breath. Bear stepped forward until he and the rival leader stood only a few feet apart. "This ground was neutral when our fathers rode," he said evenly. "It stays that way. We're here to honor the dead, not to bargain with the living." His voice was calm, but the set of his shoulders carried a warning. The rival leader smiled without warmth. "The world changed, Bear. Neutral ground belongs to whoever claims it. Pay the fee and ride in peace, or keep talking until we decide you're not worth the air." Behind him, more bikes idled in a low, menacing rhythm, their headlights throwing restless shadows across the cabin walls. Before Bear could answer, a softer sound cut through the tension, the deliberate scrape of a chair. Mrs. Delaney stepped forward. The candles painted her silver hair in gold, but her posture was pure iron. She moved between the two men with the easy authority of someone who had once done this countless times. "Enough," she said, and the word carried a weight that silenced even the rumble outside. "This pass has seen too much blood to drink more tonight." The rival leader turned, clearly startled to see her. His eyes narrowed as recognition fought its way through disbelief. "Iron Grace?" The name left his lips like an old legend resurfacing. He studied her face, and Caleb saw the shift happen, the hard lines of aggression softening into something wary, almost respectful. "I thought you were long gone," the man said after a pause. "Not gone," she answered, her voice steady and clear. "Just working in quieter ways. And still keeping my promises." She gestured toward the wall of photographs behind her. "We rode to build something bigger than fear. I haven't forgotten that. Neither should you." For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then she continued, her tone both gentle and unyielding. "You want territory. You want money. I can give you neither in the way you ask, but there is something else." She drew a folded paper from her jacket pocket, the trust documents she had carried like a second heartbeat. "I've set up a fund for the children of riders who never came home, ours and yours. It can help families on both sides if we keep this ground sacred and let the memorial ride go on. End the feud, and every orphan left in the shadow of these roads will know we did right by them." The man studied her, the fight draining from his stance even as pride wrestled to hold on. He looked at Bear, then at the silent wall of photographs, then back at the woman whose legend had shaped his own generation. The room held its breath. Outside, engines softened from a growl to a low murmur, as if even the machines were waiting. Finally he exhaled, long and slow. "Iron Grace," he said again, quieter now, "if you're asking, we'll stand down for tonight. And maybe for good." He turned to his men and gave a small signal. Hands eased away from belts. The tension in the room thinned like mist. Bear nodded once, a deep acknowledgment that carried more than words. The rival leader inclined his head to Mrs. Delaney, a gesture that looked suspiciously like respect, then turned and walked out into the cold night. One by one the other riders followed until the door closed softly behind them. The sound of their engines faded into the mountains, leaving only the steady flame of candles and the faint smell of pine. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Around him, the Hells Angels stood quiet, not triumphant, but reverent. He knew he'd just witnessed something rare, a battle stopped not by weapons, but by memory and the authority of a woman whose past carried more power than any threat. Mrs. Delaney remained where she'd stood, calm and unshaken, the embodiment of a promise that had outlived decades of road and rivalry. In the glow of flickering candles, Caleb felt a deep, humbling certainty that he would carry this night, this moment of violence dissolved by respect, far longer than any roar of engines. The night thinned into a deeper kind of quiet after the last distant engine faded into the mountains. The cabin no longer hummed with tension, it breathed. Outside, a cold wind sifted through the pines, carrying the faintest smell of rain and wood smoke. Bear and a few riders built a fire in the stone ring just beyond the porch, its glow spreading into the clearing like a second dawn. Caleb lowered himself onto a rough log beside them, the heat of the flames warming his chilled hands. Mrs. Delaney, Iron Grace, sat across from him, the firelight touching the silver in her hair until it shone like a halo. The flickering light softened the creases around her eyes and deepened the quiet authority that had turned a standoff into a handshake only an hour ago. For a long while no one spoke. The fire cracked and popped, embers lifting into the night like tiny red stars. Caleb found his thoughts drifting back to Max, imagining him asleep in Mrs. Holbrook's spare bed, one arm curled under his pillow the way he always slept. The boy's breathing would be slow and even by now. That picture steadied him, but it also sharpened his questions. What kind of world was he really handing to his son? He'd always thought of courage as something private, keeping a small family afloat on hard work and quiet love. Tonight had widened that view until it stretched past the hills. He watched Bear staring into the flames, the scar on his cheek etched deeper by the light. This man could have answered violence with violence, could have fed every stereotype that followed the name Hells Angels. Instead, he had waited, listened, and finally bowed to the wisdom of an elder who once rode harder than any of them. Caleb saw the choice it took to stand down when adrenaline begged for action. That choice was its own kind of fight, harder in some ways than throwing a punch. It reminded him of the discipline it took to raise Max without bitterness, to show patience when grief pressed against every nerve, different battles, same steel. Mrs. Delaney's gaze met his, and for an instant Caleb felt as if she could see every layer of his life. The long evenings over carburetors, the quiet panic over late bills, the moments when he feared he wasn't enough. She nodded almost imperceptibly, as though she understood that those silent efforts carried the same weight as any daring ride through gunfire. Strength, she seemed to say without words, has more than one face. It can be leather and chrome, or flour and pie crust, or a man teaching his son to trust the truth even when it hurts. The fire shifted, sending a spray of sparks upward. Bear finally broke the silence. "My father used to tell me that real honor isn't what people see on the road. It's what you do when no one's looking." He poked at the embers with a stick, his voice steady but thoughtful. "Tonight proved him right again. None of us will get headlines for letting peace win, but maybe our kids will feel the difference without ever knowing why." The words settled on Caleb like a warm weight. He thought of Max growing into a man who might never have to face down rival gangs or carry the memory of lost brothers, yet who would need courage all the same, courage to keep promises, to build instead of break, to hold steady when the world leaned toward anger. He wanted that for his son more than any inheritance of money or land. Maybe that was what he'd been working toward all along, even if he hadn't named it until this night. The fire's warmth sank deeper into his bones. Caleb felt a quiet pride rising, not the kind that puffed the chest, but the kind that steadies the heart. He realized he was sitting among people who had lived fierce lives, yet still believed in mending what violence tried to tear apart. He, too, had chosen a life that mended, late nights at the garage to keep food on the table, small rituals with Max to keep joy alive. He hadn't seen those acts as heroic before, but under the cold stars of Iron Creek Pass they looked different, necessary, noble in their own scale. Mrs. Delaney began to speak, her voice low and rich with memory. She told of nights when peace talks stretched until dawn, of children she'd met whose fathers never came back, of a promise to funnel every spare dollar into a fund that would give those children a future bigger than the roads that had taken so much from their families. It was never about the ride, she said, looking into the fire. It was about what the ride could protect. The words folded into Caleb's heart like a quiet vow. He found himself answering almost without thinking. I fix engines. I raise my boy. Some days it feels small. She shook her head, the firelight catching her smile. Nothing small about keeping a promise, she said. That's the whole road, whether it's on two wheels or in a garage. Bear nodded in agreement, and the circle of riders murmured their assent. Caleb felt something inside settle, a recognition that the code these bikers lived by wasn't so far from the life he'd been piecing together in Willow Creek. Loyalty, sacrifice, the stubborn belief that you finish what you start. Those were his roads, too. The sky above the mountains began to pale, a faint silver edge announcing the first hint of dawn. The fire burned lower, its heat sinking into the earth. Caleb rose and stretched, the night's cold retreating, before a quiet sense of purpose he hadn't known he carried. He thought of the day ahead, of Max waking to sunlight, and the promise that his father would come home, as he'd said. Strength, he understood now, wasn't about the roar of engines or the size of a legend. It was the steady choice to honor a word, to build peace one act at a time. As the last stars faded, Caleb looked from Bear to Mrs. Delaney and felt a kinship that would outlast the night. They were all keepers of different roads, bound by a code that needed no patch on a jacket. In the soft morning light, he found not just relief, but a quiet, enduring pride, knowing he would carry the lessons of this night back to Willow Creek and into every small promise he made to his son. The first thin edge of morning bled across the peaks, turning the sky from deep cobalt to soft rose. A chill lingered in the air, carrying the damp scent of pine needles and cooling ash from the dying fire. Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing and watched the darkness retreat, the mountains sharpening into shape as sunlight gathered at their crowns. Every rock and tree seemed to stretch awake. The cabin behind him, with its wall of photographs and fading candles, felt like a dream he might have imagined if not for the steady rumble of engines preparing to roll. The riders moved with quiet purpose, packing gear and checking chains without the noise or swagger of a typical club gathering. It wasn't bravado that filled the space now, but reverence. Leather jackets creaked softly, and chrome caught the newborn light in bright, sudden flashes. Each man carried the stillness of someone about to enter a kind of service. Caleb sensed it wasn't just another ride. It was a ritual shaped by years of remembrance, a hymn on wheels for those who never came back. Mrs. Delaney stepped from the cabin like the embodiment of the dawn itself, silver hair glowing against the soft gold of early sun. The jacket she wore the night before was zipped against the mountain chill, but her posture held a warmth that needed no clothing. When she reached Caleb, her eyes carried the same calm, that had disarmed the Ravenlords and stitched old rivalries into uneasy truce. "You ride with us," she said simply. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a gift. Caleb started to protest, to explain that he had never ridden anything bigger than a lawnmower, but she shook her head gently. "Behind Bear," she said, "every generation has to bring someone new to the road. Tonight, it's you. Consider it a thank you for keeping your word when you could have stayed safe." There was no argument to offer after that. He only nodded, the gravity of her words sinking like a weight that somehow steadied him. Bear approached with 2 helmets, one worn smooth by years of travel, and another shining like it had been waiting for this very morning. "Ready?" he asked, a quiet smile carving lines into his scarred face. Caleb hesitated only long enough to glance back at the cabin where so many stories still lingered. Then he slipped on the helmet and swung onto the seat behind Bear, his hands finding the side rails with an awkwardness that made the older man chuckle. "Just lean when I lean," Bear said. "The road will do the rest." Engines came alive one by one, a low thunder rolling through the pass until it felt as though the earth itself was breathing with them. The air filled with the rich scent of gasoline and cold mountain air. Caleb felt the vibration of Bear's bike beneath him, steady and powerful, a living thing eager to move. Mrs. Delaney raised her hand in silent salute, and the convoy answered with a unified rev that echoed against the cliffs like the opening note of a hymn. They set off as the sun breached the ridge, a sudden spill of gold washing the road ahead. The bikes rolled out in perfect formation, 2 sweeping columns that wound through the narrow mountain passes like a river of steel and light. Caleb clung tighter as Bear leaned into the first curve, the world tilting just enough to steal his breath. The wind sliced through his jacket, cold and pure, carrying the mingled aromas of pine and engine oil. It was at once exhilarating and strangely peaceful, a balance of speed and stillness he had never known. From his place in the sidecar the night before, he had watched their discipline. Now he felt it in his bones. Every signal, an arm lifted, a boot tapped, a quick double rev, moved through the riders like an electrical current. The road itself seemed to yield to their unity, each bend and incline accepted without resistance. The echo of their passage filled the valleys, a sound both mournful and triumphant, as though the mountains themselves were acknowledging the lives honored in every mile. Caleb's mind drifted to Max. He imagined his son waking to soft morning light in Mrs. Holbrook's spare room, unaware of where his father rode, but somehow sensing that something important was happening. He hoped that one day he could describe this feeling to him, the way 100 riders could become a single heartbeat, the way memory could carry forward on the hum of wheels and the promise of peace. Perhaps Max wouldn't need to know the names of every fallen rider to inherit the lesson that courage isn't measured by noise or spectacle, but by the quiet commitment to protect what matters. The ride stretched on, mile after mile of winding asphalt and unfolding vistas. At each turn the sun climbed higher, warming Caleb's back and throwing long, dramatic shadows of the bikes across the cliffs. He caught glimpses of eagles wheeling overhead, of wildflowers clinging stubbornly to stone, of deep valleys where mist still slept. All of it felt sharpened, more vivid, as if the world itself was leaning closer to listen. Somewhere near the summit, Bear slowed, and the formation tightened. Mrs. Delaney rode near the front, her silver hair catching the sun like a trail of light. Caleb realized she was leading them on a final circuit of places where old battles had cooled and fragile truces had held. Every stop of her eyes seemed to seal a memory and release a blessing. He understood then that this wasn't just about remembering the dead. It was about anchoring the living to a purpose that could outlast even grief. By the time they descended toward the pass again, the road was bright with full morning. The fire in the cabin clearing had burned down to quiet ash, but the riders' spirits seemed newly lit. As Bear eased the bike to a stop and Caleb swung his leg to the ground, he felt a rush of clarity unlike anything he'd known. For a few unmeasured hours, he had belonged to something vast and steady, a fellowship built not on fear, but on promises honored across generations. He removed his helmet and let the cool air wash over him. Across the clearing, Mrs. Delaney met his gaze and gave a small nod, as if to say that the road had accepted him, if only for this one sacred ride. Caleb felt gratitude rise like the sun itself, gratitude for her courage, for Bear's trust, for the quiet strength that had carried them all here. He whispered a silent thank you to the woman who had led him into this hidden world, and without ever asking, had shown him how wide a single life can be when it's lived in the service of something larger than itself. The ride back to Willow Creek felt softer, as if the road itself had exhaled. Morning light spilled across the hills in calm ribbons, warming the sidecar until Caleb could finally loosen his grip. The roar of engines that had filled the night now carried a quieter tone, less battle hymn and more benediction. By the time the convoy rolled into the empty lot of his garage, the sun was fully awake, brushing the rooftops of town in gold. It looked like any other morning. No one would guess how close the night had come to breaking, and how gracefully it had been mended. Mrs. Delaney stepped from her car with the same poise she had shown in the cabin pavement, the leather jacket still on her shoulders, but her face lit by a gentler light. She walked toward Caleb with steady purpose and placed something small and heavy in his palm, a weathered biker medallion, its surface worn smooth by decades of road and rain. "This belongs with you now," she said quietly. "It carries the spirit of those who ride for peace, not just speed. Keep it for when you need reminding." Then she pressed a sealed envelope into his other hand. "For Max's future. No one else needs to know, except him, when the time is right." Words failed him. He could only nod as gratitude and disbelief tangled in his chest. She had folded an entire lifetime of courage and quiet generosity into a simple token and a piece of paper, trusting him to carry it forward. Bear approached, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He clasped Caleb's hand in both of his, the grip firm and steady. "You've got brothers on the road now," he said. "If you ever need us, no matter the reason, just send a word through Grace. Your family behind him." The other riders lifted their helmets in silent acknowledgement before mounting their bikes. The promise was unspoken yet immense, a lifetime of protection and solidarity from men who lived by a code older than any law. One by one, the engines flared back to life, their rumble swelling and then fading as the convoy threaded out of town like a long, low storm that had decided to move on. Soon, only the scent of exhaust and pine remained, dissolving into the ordinary sounds of a waking day, birds calling from power lines, a truck shifting gears on the distant highway, a neighbor's door creaking open for the morning paper. Caleb stood in the cooling silence beside the red sports car, the medallion warm in his fist, the envelope pressed to his heart. The garage looked the same, but something essential inside him had shifted. He thought of Max still asleep next door, of the quiet life they would return to, and knew it would never feel quite as small again. Through one unexpected night, he had discovered a wider family and a deeper definition of strength. Promises kept, peace chosen, courage carried, without spectacle. As the last echo of engines melted into the brightening sky, Caleb remained still for a long moment, grateful and changed. A single father, now bound to a road that reached far beyond the borders of his small town. The day drifted forward like a slow exhale after a long-held breath. By late afternoon, the garage had returned to its usual rhythm, tools neatly racked, air carrying the familiar scents of oil and rubber. But everything felt touched by a quiet strangeness, as though the night's thunder still hummed beneath the floorboards. Caleb finished a routine tire rotation for a regular customer and locked the front door earlier than usual. He wanted the silence, the chance to stand still with what had happened. The red sports car sat outside under the clear September sun, looking almost ordinary now, though he knew it never would be again. Max bounded in from Mrs. Holbrook's house a little before supper, face flushed with stories of pancakes and board games. He wrapped his arms around Caleb's waist and announced that he'd slept like a rock, never guessing that his father had ridden through a night of old grudges and long promises. Caleb knelt to meet his son's eyes and held him a heartbeat longer than usual, feeling the weight of everything he wanted to protect without spilling a single detail. "Glad you're home, buddy," he said softly, and meant it with a depth Max could only feel, not yet name. When the evening finally settled and Max was reading in his room, Caleb remembered the sealed envelope Mrs. Delaney had pressed into his hand at dawn. It lay on the kitchen table where he had set it after breakfast, the edges of the paper still sharp, the script across the front neat and unhurried. For hours he had passed it by, as though waiting for the house itself to be still enough to open it. Now the time felt right. He sat down, the wooden chair creaking under him, and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavyweight paper folded around something sturdier. The first thing he saw was a certificate of deposit, with Max's name printed in clean black letters, the kind issued by a trust fund designed to grow quietly over years. The amount written on the line startled him so much he read it twice, then a third time. It was enough to pay for college anywhere his boy might dream of going, enough to rewrite futures. A low breath escaped him, almost a laugh, half disbelief and half gratitude too deep for words. Beneath the certificate lay a handwritten note on thick stationery, the ink a deep blue that had bled just slightly into the fibers, for the son of a man who chose trust and courage over fear. Grace. The signature was a single word, but it carried every layer of the woman he had met, the gentle baker, the legendary mediator, the quiet architect of peace. He read the sentence again and again, until the letters blurred and steadied and blurred again. Something in it went straight to the place inside him where doubt had always lived. The late-night worry that he wasn't enough for Max, that love and honest work might not be sufficient to shape a strong life. Grace's words felt like an answer spoken directly to that fear. Caleb leaned back in the chair, the note open in his hand, and let the meaning settle. A simple choice, to stay late and fix a sputtering car, to listen instead of question, had carried him into a story of debts and courage older than he could have imagined. And now that choice had returned as a gift for his son, proof that quiet integrity could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. He thought of Bear's deep handshake and the promise of unseen brothers on distant roads, of the memorial ride echoing like a hymn through the mountains, of the woman who had stood unshaken between rival clubs and reminded them all of their better selves. Every fragment converged in the small, extraordinary fact of the envelope in his hands. After a while he rose and went to Max's room. The boy had fallen asleep with a book resting on his chest, the late summer breeze stirring the curtain above his head. Caleb watched him for a long minute, the trust fund certificate and note warming in his pocket. He thought about the years ahead, school projects, teenage restlessness, the first time Max would stand in the world entirely on his own. For the first time since his wife's death. The future felt not only possible but spacious, filled with choices he and his son could make without fear. Back in the living room, the biker medallion lay on the coffee table where he'd set it that morning. He picked it up and felt its cool weight against his palm, the metal worn smooth by countless miles. It wasn't decoration, it was a story forged into metal, nights of danger and loyalty, a code that valued promises above everything. He opened Max's keepsake box, a small wooden chest where the boy stored arrowheads, baseball cards, and a handful of secret treasures, and placed the medallion carefully inside. One day, when Max was older and ready to hear the whole tale, he would understand why his father had kept this piece of history close. For now, it could wait like a quiet talisman, a reminder that strength sometimes rides a long road before arriving at your door. Caleb turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching the last blush of sunset fade over Willow Creek. The garage across the lot rested in familiar shadow, but it felt different now, like the starting point of a larger journey. In his chest was a calm he hadn't known in years, pride without noise, gratitude without demand. A single late-night repair had opened a path from his modest life to something vast and enduring. And as he listened to the crickets take up their evening chorus, he whispered a simple thank you into the dark, certain that somewhere out on the endless road Grace would hear. The weeks slid by with the easy rhythm of early autumn, each day marked by the familiar scent of motor oil and the crisp bite of cooler air. On the surface, nothing about Willow Creek seemed different. The leaves turned amber, school buses groaned along their routes, and the small garage at the edge of town opened its doors at the same steady hour each morning. Yet Caleb felt change everywhere, subtle but undeniable, like the quiet current beneath a calm river. Customers began arriving from places he didn't recognize, riders with road maps in their eyes and patches from clubs he'd only heard about in passing. Some came with small jobs, others with complex rebuilds. All of them mentioned a friend of a friend who'd spoken highly of his work. A man from Montana leaned against the counter one afternoon and said, almost casually, "The brothers said, you know how to keep a promise as well as an engine running." Caleb only nodded, understanding the deeper message. The night at Iron Creek Pass hadn't made the papers, but it had traveled the way true stories do, by word of mouth, carried with respect. Business grew without fanfare. Parts arrived on time, bills were paid without the old knot of worry in his stomach, and for the first time in years he began to imagine a future that wasn't one emergency away from collapse. He never spoke of the hidden trust fund that now sat quietly in Max's name. That was Grace's gift, meant for the years ahead. But every time he balanced the books and saw a cushion forming where once there had been a razor edge, he thought of the woman who had turned an ordinary garage into a crossroads of loyalty. Max noticed the difference too, though in a child's way. He liked the new stream of visitors, men and women, with sun-browned faces and stories etched in the scuffs of their boots. They brought him small souvenirs, a turquoise stone from Arizona, a tiny brass bell from a long ride in India, a well-worn comic book that had crossed 3 states in a saddlebag, and he kept asking about the medallion now resting in his keepsake box. "Who gave it to us, Dad? And why does it feel heavy even though it's small?" Caleb would sit with him at the kitchen table in the soft light after dinner, and tell a version of the story he judged right for a 10-year-old heart. He spoke of a brave friend named Grace, who once helped people settle fights without fists or guns. He told how a group of riders rode all night, not to cause trouble, but to keep a promise to their lost brothers. He described courage not as something loud, but as the quiet strength to protect others and keep one's word. Max listened wide-eyed, turning the medallion over in his hands as if it might speak. Sometimes he asked if he could wear it to school, and Caleb would smile and say, "Not yet. One day when you need its reminder." Through those conversations, Caleb discovered something new in himself. He had always thought of legacy as something grand and public, written in headlines or carved in stone. But Grace's life had been different, and so had his own. Their kind of legacy lived in quiet commitments that outlast noise and spectacle, in trust funds hidden until needed, in friendships that dissolve violence, in the steady presence of a parent who shows up every day. He began to see his own daily choices, staying late to fix a car, keeping promises to Max, treating strangers with respect, as part of the same unbroken thread. On cool evenings, he sometimes walked the gravel lot behind the garage and let memory unfold. He could still feel the vibration of that night's ride humming through him, the disciplined roar of engines carrying an unspoken code. He would think of Grace standing in candlelight, calm as stone, and of Bear's quiet assurance that Caleb now had brothers on roads he might never travel. The knowledge filled him with a gratitude that didn't need words. Yet it wasn't nostalgia that lingered most. It was the sense of direction. He worked with a surer hand now, not because his skill had changed, but because he understood what his work meant. A way to provide, to keep faith with the people who trusted him, to make the world a fraction steadier for a boy who was learning by watching every move. When Max helped sweep the shop floor on Saturdays, Caleb felt the lesson carrying forward, the understanding that strength is service, and that a man's word, once given, becomes part of the architecture of someone else's life. Mrs. Delaney stopped by once or twice, always with a pie and a warm smile, never with a hint of the road's danger. They spoke of small things, recipes, the changing weather, a new trail Max might like to hike. But when their eyes met, there was an unspoken acknowledgment of the night that had bound them together. No one else needed to know. The legacy wasn't in the telling, but in the living. By the time the first frost silvered the fields, Caleb understood what Grace had truly left behind. It wasn't the money folded into a bank account or even the medallion gleaming in a wooden box. It was the quiet certainty that the strongest lives are measured not in miles or headlines, but in promises kept and in the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. That knowledge settled deep and steady, like a well-tuned engine ready for any road ahead. The last light of winter slid across Willow Creek like molten copper, setting the clouds ablaze before sinking behind the ridgeline. Caleb stood outside his garage with a rag over his shoulder, the day's final smudges of oil still on his hands. The air smelled faintly of cold pine and warm asphalt, a scent that always reminded him of beginnings. Beside the building, Max chased a worn soccer ball in crooked arcs across the gravel, laughter ringing through the dusk like a bell that belonged to no clock. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching his son's uneven kicks and grinning at the boy's unstoppable joy. From somewhere beyond the hills, a low hum reached him, so soft at first he almost missed it. Engines. Not close, just a rolling throb deep in the distance, the sound of a road alive with travelers. Months ago, that noise would have tightened his chest and sent his mind racing back to the long night when 100 Hell's Angels filled this same lot with chrome and thunder. Tonight, it brought something entirely different, a quiet lift of the heart, a reminder of friendships forged in silence and sealed in trust. The memory of that night no longer carried fear. It carried a kind of music. He thought of Bear's steady handshake, of Mrs. Delaney's calm voice weaving peace between old enemies, of the letter that had changed his son's future before Max even knew to dream of college. He thought of the medallion resting in the keepsake box, waiting for the day when Max would be ready to hear the whole story. These were not just memories. They were living links to a brotherhood that now stretched far beyond the county line, unseen but undeniable. He knew that if he ever needed help, a part too rare to find, a sudden crisis with Max, a threat he couldn't face alone, those distant engines would not stay distant for long. The evening deepened into that soft in-between when shadows blur and the first stars begin to blink awake. Caleb wiped his hands on the rag and felt a calm settle through him, the kind that comes when life fits into a shape you finally recognize. He remembered the night Mrs. Delaney's red sports car had limped into his garage, how simple it had seemed to roll up the door and reach for a wrench, a routine favor for a neighbor. Yet that single choice had opened a path into histories and friendships he could never have planned. It had brought trust where strangers had once stood, and given his son a legacy more powerful than money alone could ever provide. Max kicked the ball toward him with a triumphant shout. Caleb caught it with one foot and sent it back gently, their small game weaving into the evening like an unspoken prayer. Watching his son chase the ball again, he felt the shape of his own life with fresh clarity. He was still a single father running a modest shop, but something vast now moved quietly through his days, a confidence that unseen networks of care can rise out of the most ordinary acts, that strength is built as much in trust as in muscle. The low rumble of the far-off bikes faded to a hush, but the sense of presence remained, like a distant horizon that kept the world wider than what he could see. He knew the Brotherhood was out there, carrying their code of loyalty and peace along endless highways. And he knew that in some way he and Max rode with them, part of a lineage that measured courage not by noise or spectacle, but by promises honored and lives protected. Caleb turned back toward the garage, its windows glowing warm against the cool night. He had a late oil change to finish and a pot of Max's favorite spaghetti waiting on the stove. Simple tasks, but no longer small. Every turn of the wrench, every shared meal, every bedtime story now felt braided into something larger, strengthened by that unforgettable night when a hidden legend named Iron Grace turned an ordinary mechanic into a keeper of a promise. As the first star sharpened in the sky, Caleb drew a long breath and let it out slow. The world around him, his son's laughter, the quiet shop, the faint echo of engines, had all been touched by a single decision to help an old woman on a smoky summer evening. He understood now that he would be discovering the meaning of that choice for years to come, each day revealing another thread in the tapestry Grace had begun to weave decades earlier. With heart steady and spirit open, he stepped back inside, carrying the certainty that a simple act of trust had forever widened the road ahead. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes small acts can spark big change. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe. More life-changing journeys are on the way.